raising his sword to execute Kalen. Chapter 45, The King's Intent. Rudra was leaping across the rusted canopy of the iron forest, moving miles with every bound. His observation haki continuously scanned the environment, mapping out the ruins. Daily sign-in reset. Location: Ancient Sovereign's Ruin, Inner Ring. Would you like to sign in? Sign in. Sign in successful. Reward: House Hoku Haki, Conqueror's Haki, One Piece Universe. A rare form of haki that cannot be attained through training. It allows the user to exert their own willpower over others. Can be used to dominate beasts, shatter weak wills, and physically clash with energy constructs. A profound, absolute sensation of supremacy flooded Rudra's consciousness. It wasn't physical strength. It was the absolute, unshakable certainty of a king. It was the spiritual manifestation of standing at the apex of existence. Simultaneously, his spider sense and observation haki pinged violently. 3 miles ahead, he felt Kalen's aura rapidly fading, suppressed by 5 incredibly sharp Xian-Tian energy signatures. Rudra's eyes narrowed. He didn't particularly care for the arrogant Sector 7 elites, but they were vain students. More importantly, he despised the Central Continent's brand of arrogance, men who thought they were gods just because they had inherited a better breathing technique. Hold on a little longer, Rudra muttered. He didn't just use Soru. He activated his Jeppo, Skywalk, kicking off the very air itself. The sonic boom shattered the metal trees below him as he launched himself toward the energy signatures like a fired railgun slug. Chapter 46, Bow to the Apex. Li Wei swung his sword down toward Kalen's neck. Kalen closed his eyes, waiting for the cold sting of death. Boom! A black shadow slammed into the ground between them with the force of a meteorite. The shockwave of the impact sent Li Wei stumbling backward, his sword strike deflected by the sheer kinetic displacement of air. The dust cleared. Rudra stood over the kneeling Sector 7 elites. His dark uniform was immaculate, and his eyes were cold, calculating pools of black. You! Kalen gasped, staring at Rudra's back in absolute shock. Li Wei recovered his footing, his face twisting in rage. You! The cripple from the staging ground. The one who offended the young master. Perfect! I will take your head and present it to him as a gift. The 5 heavenly sword disciples surrounded Rudra, their Xian-Tian auras flaring to the absolute maximum. The air grew razor sharp, the ambient chi condensing into hundreds of ethereal swords floating around them. Die! Li Wei roared, commanding the swords to rain down on Rudra. Rudra didn't move. He didn't activate the inner gates. He didn't even coat his body in armament haki. He simply looked at them. And he unleashed the Conqueror's haki. It wasn't a physical attack, but it hit harder than a mountain. A wave of invisible, oppressive, absolute willpower erupted from Rudra's body. The air turned black with spiritual lightning. The moment the Conqueror's haki clashed with the heavenly sword Sec's Xian-Tian auras, the ethereal swords stopped dead in mid-air. They vibrated violently before shattering into dust, completely overwhelmed by Rudra's spiritual pressure. The physical toll on the disciples was instantaneous. Their eyes rolled into the backs of their heads. Their Xian-Tian chi shields offered zero defense against an attack on the mind and spirit. 4 of the disciples instantly foamed at the mouth and collapsed to the ground, unconscious. Li Wei, as the strongest, managed to stay on his feet, but his legs were shaking uncontrollably. Blood poured from his nose. He looked at Rudra not with arrogance, but with the primal, instinctual terror of a prey animal looking at an apex predator. What are you? Li Wei choked out, dropping his sword. I am the ceiling you will never reach, Rudra said. He blurred forward, appearing directly in front of Li Wei. He grabbed the disciple by the throat, lifted him off the ground, and casually tossed him into a rusted metal tree trunk. The impact shattered Li Wei's ribs and rendered him instantly unconscious. Rudra turned back to Kalen and the Sector 7 elites, the oppressive haki vanishing as quickly as it appeared. "Get up," Rudra ordered. "We're going to the palace." Chapter 47, The Sovereign's Palace. The center of the ruin was breathtaking. A colossal palace carved from white jade floated above a massive crater, connected to the ground by a single, sprawling staircase of obsidian. At the top of the stairs, the massive bronze doors of the palace were slowly being forced open. Young Master Jian Chen stood before the doors, his hands glowing with a blinding white light as he deciphered the ancient sealing array. Around him stood 10 of the Heavenly Sword Sect's most elite core disciples, forming a defensive perimeter. Jian Chen smiled as the heavy doors finally clicked. The Sovereign's Inheritance. With this domain-level artifact, my Heavenly Sword Sect will rule the central continent. Young Master, a voice interrupted. Jian Chen frowned and turned around. Walking up the obsidian staircase was a single figure in black. Behind him, staying a safe distance down the steps, were the 4 Sector 7 elites. Rudra ascended the stairs with casual, unhurried steps. Li Wei failed to clear the trash, Jian Chen noted, his eyes narrowing in annoyance. "No matter. You have a little brute strength, outer sector dog, but this is a sacred ground. I will not tolerate your presence." Jian Chen gestured to his 10 core disciples. "Kill him. Leave nothing but ash." The 10 disciples, all peak stage Xiantian masters, drew their swords simultaneously. They didn't underestimate him. They formed the 10-directional heaven severing array, a sect technique designed to trap and execute beasts far above their level. 10 massive pillars of sword chi erupted into the purple sky, forming a cage of razor-sharp energy around Rudra. "Any last words, cripple?" one of the disciples sneered. Rudra cracked his neck. "First gate. Second gate. Third gate, open." His skin flushed crimson. The green aura of kinetic bioenergy exploded outward, forcefully pushing back the oppressive sword array. "I don't need words," Rudra said, his Sharingan spinning to life. "I need combat data." Chapter 48, Shattering the Array. Rudra moved. To the disciples, it didn't look like speed, it looked like teleportation. The sheer explosive force of the third gate combined with Zora was beyond the tracking capabilities of a standard Xiantian master. Rudra appeared instantly in front of the disciple maintaining the northern pillar of the array. The disciple panicked, projecting a massive shield of condensed sword intent. Rudra coated his fist in black armament haki and punched. Because of his newly acquired spatial friction, his fist didn't just hit the shield, it gripped the space around the shield and tore it apart. Crack boom! The energy shield shattered like cheap glass. Rudra's fist continued forward, burying itself deep into the disciple's chest. The kinetic shockwave blew a hole straight through the disciple's back, sending his lifeless body flying off the obsidian staircase. 1, Rudra counted, turning his crimson eyes to the others. "Maintain the array," a disciple screamed. "Attack!" 9 condensed beams of sword chi converged on Rudra from all directions. Rudra inhaled sharply. Water breathing, third form, flowing dance. His movements became incredibly fluid and unpredictable. He weaved through the converging sword beams with microscopic precision, his Sharingan predicting the exact trajectory of every attack. When a beam came too close, he simply swatted it away with his haki-coated hands, the spatial friction shattering the energy constructs effortlessly. He closed the distance to 2 more disciples. A sweeping low kick infused with the density of his psion/Kryptonian cells snapped their legs like twigs. As they fell, he drove his elbows down onto their skulls, driving them straight into the indestructible obsidian steps. "Monster, he's a monster," one of the disciples yelled, breaking the array and attempting to flee. Rudra flicked his wrist, picking up a dropped sword. He infused it with armament haki, turning the blade pitch black, and hurled it like a javelin. The sword broke the sound barrier, catching the fleeing disciple perfectly in the spine and pinning him to the palace walls. In less than 30 seconds, the 10-directional array was broken, and half of the elite disciples were dead or crippled. The remaining 5 stood trembling, their swords shaking in their hands. They couldn't comprehend what they were fighting. Young Master Jian Chen, who had been watching in silent shock, finally stepped forward. His jade-like face was contorted with absolute, murderous rage. "Enough!" Jian Chen roared. A terrifying aura erupted from Jian Chen. It wasn't just Xiantian energy. The space around him began to warp, solidifying into a distinct, pale white sphere of influence that covered the top of the staircase. "A pseudo-domain," Kalen gasped from the bottom of the stairs. "He's touched the domain realm." Jian Chen drew his personal weapon, a translucent, crystalline sword that hummed with the laws of the universe. Inside his pseudo-domain, Jian Chen was an absolute god. The gravity within the sphere multiplied tenfold, attempting to crush Rudra into the ground. Jian Chen pointed the crystal sword at Rudra. "You force me to use the sect's greatest secret. In my domain, I command the laws of physics. Kneel, and die." Rudra stood in the center of the oppressive gravity field. He didn't kneel. He didn't even bend. He looked around the pseudo-domain, his Sharingan analyzing the fluctuating spatial walls. "You call this a domain?" Rudra scoffed, his green third gate aura burning furiously against the pressure. "It's nothing but a fragile bubble." Rudra raised his fists, coated them in pitch-black haki, and looked Jian Chen dead in the eyes. "Let me show you how to pop it." Chapter 49, Popping the Bubble. The pseudo-domain of young Master Jian Chen was a masterpiece of central continent cultivation. Inside this 20-meter sphere, gravity was magnified, the air was as thick as mud, and every speck of ambient energy obeyed Jian Chen's will. "Heavenly severing void slash!" Jian Chen roared, swinging his crystalline sword. The entire pseudo-domain reacted. The ambient energy condensed into a massive, translucent blade that descended upon Rudra. This wasn't a standard energy attack, it was a conceptual strike. It locked onto Rudra's spatial coordinates, making evasion impossible. Rudra didn't try to evade. His crimson Sharingan tracked the descending blade of energy. The green aura of the third gate flared violently, fighting back against the crushing gravity. Rudra raised his right arm. His skin, already flushed crimson from the inner gates, turned pitch black as he layered it with maximum armament haki. But he didn't just punch. He engaged the spatial friction he had assimilated from the Void Weaver Mantis. His hand clamped shut entirely around the descending blade of sword chi. Jian Chen's eyes widened in horror. You caught it." "It's just condensed space and intent," Rudra said, his voice straining slightly under the immense pressure. "If it occupies physical space, it can be broken." Rudra squeezed his fingers. His terrifying physical density, amplified by the third gate and layered with haki, simply overwhelmed the fragile laws of the pseudo-domain. Crack! The heavenly severing void slash shattered into millions of crystalline shards that dissolved into the air. Before Jian Chen could process the impossibility of what he had just witnessed, Rudra lunged. He didn't aim for Jian Chen. He aimed for the absolute edge of the white sphere that formed the pseudo-domain. Rudra slammed his haki-coated fists directly into the invisible barrier of the domain. He dug his fingers into the fabric of the spatial construct, his muscles bulging as the spatial friction allowed him to physically grip the energy. "What are you doing?" Jian Chen screamed, coughing up blood as his mental connection to the domain was violently assaulted. "Popping the bubble," Rudra replied. With a guttural roar, Rudra violently ripped his arms apart. The sound was like a sheet of thick canvas being torn beside a microphone. The pseudo-domain violently imploded. The backlash of the shattered spatial law slammed directly into Jian Chen. The young master's crystalline sword shattered, and his body was launched backward, crashing heavily against the bronze doors of the sovereign's palace. Jian Chen slumped to the ground, his dantian severely cracked, his meridians utterly ruined by the backlash of his own broken domain. The unparalleled genius of the heavenly sword sect was completely crippled. Rudra deactivated the third gate, exhaling a massive cloud of steam. He turned to look down the obsidian stairs. Kalen and the other Sector 7 elites were staring at him with a mixture of absolute reverence and primal terror. "Stay here," Rudra commanded. "Don't touch his body. If his sect wants to pick up their trash, let them." Rudra turned around and pushed his massive, dense hands against the ancient bronze doors of the sovereign's palace. With a heavy groan that shook the foundations of the ruin, the doors gave way, revealing total darkness within. Rudra stepped inside. Chapter 50, The Sovereign's Shadow. The interior of the palace was not grand or opulent. It was a singular, massive hall made of cold, unadorned black stone. At the far end of the hall sat a simple throne carved from a meteorite, and hovering above it was a glowing, ethereal sphere of golden light. As Rudra approached, the golden sphere pulsed, and a projection materialized in front of the throne. It was an old man with a flowing white beard, dressed in simple grey robes. He possessed no physical body, but the sheer spiritual pressure radiating from this remnant soul was heavier than anything Rudra had encountered. This was a true master, a soul transformation expert who had left a fragment of his consciousness behind. "A mortal vessel has breached my sanctum," the sovereign's projection spoke, his voice echoing in Rudra's mind rather than his ears. "Yet, my senses tell me you possess no dantian. You are entirely devoid of the heavenly Tao's energy. How did a cripple break the seal on my doors?" "I don't need the heavenly Tao," Rudra said, his posture relaxed. "I have my own." The sovereign's eyes narrowed. Suddenly, a terrifying wave of spiritual pressure descended upon the hall. It wasn't a physical attack, it was a soul-crushing weight designed to force intruders to kneel, filtering out those with weak wills. Rudra felt the pressure pressing against his mind. But instead of buckling, a deeply ingrained instinct flared within him. The conqueror's haki. Rudra didn't even blink. He released a wave of his own supreme willpower. The black, spiritual lightning of the conqueror clashed directly with the sovereign's soul transformation pressure. The air in the throne room violently distorted, but Rudra remained standing, his hands casually resting in his pockets. The sovereign's projection recoiled slightly, absolute shock washing over his ethereal face. "A king's intent," the sovereign whispered. "Without cultivating the soul, your raw willpower manifests as a physical force. You have forged your physical body to the point where your spirit has naturally ascended to match it. A pure body cultivator. I thought such paths were myths of the primordial era." The old man began to laugh, a booming, joyful sound that echoed through the dark hall. "Excellent. The heavenly Tao is a shackle, boy. Cultivators borrow the world's energy, meaning the world can always take it back. But you are entirely self-contained. A true anomaly." The sovereign gestured to the glowing golden sphere hovering above the throne. "I am sovereign king. I died 3,000 years ago trying to break into the law comprehension realm. My inheritance is not a weapon, nor is it a chi manual. It is a world seed, a condensed fragment of raw dimensional space I ripped from the void." Sovereign King looked at Rudra seriously. "A normal cultivator would use this to forge a perfect domain. But your body might actually be strong enough to absorb it directly into your flesh. Take it, anomaly. Let me see how far a mortal vessel can ascend." Chapter 51, The Limitless Concept. Rudra walked up to the throne and stared at the glowing golden world seed. It didn't radiate heat or cold, it radiated depth. Looking at it was like staring down an endless well. Daily sign-in reset. Location: Ancient Sovereign's Throne Room, High Dimensional Density. Would you like to sign in? Sign in. Sign in successful. Reward, limitless, infinity, Jujutsu Kaisen universe, fragment. A conceptual technique that brings the concept of infinity into reality. As the host lacks cursed energy, this fragment utilizes the host's bioelectric aura and spatial friction to passively manipulate space on an atomic level. Note: passively active. Anything approaching the host will slow down infinitely, never truly making contact unless the host allows it. Rudra's eyes widened slightly. Limitless. Combined with the spatial friction he already possessed, his Kryptonian bio-aura had just evolved into an absolute, conceptual defense mechanism. He reached out his hand to touch the world seed. As his fingers brushed the golden sphere, he deliberately dropped his infinity barrier, allowing contact. The world seed instantly melted into golden liquid light and rushed up his arm, sinking into his veins. The reaction was catastrophic. This wasn't a beast core. This was a literal fragment of a dimension. The immense pressure inside Rudra's body spiked to ungodly levels. His scion blood boiled, roaring in defiance as the dimensional energy tried to tear his atoms apart. His Kryptonian cells, supercharged by the sheer volume of ambient energy in the room, rapidly synthesized the golden light, acting as a buffer. Rudra dropped to one knee, a low, guttural growl escaping his throat. His bones cracked and instantly healed, becoming denser, absorbing the spatial laws. His blood turned a faint, shimmering gold before settling back to deep crimson. Assimilation progress, Scion bloodline at 25%, Zenkai boost triggered. Kryptonian cells at 20%. Physical vessel grade, domain realm equivalent. Host's cellular structure now passively generates its own localized gravity and spatial anchoring. When Rudra stood up, the air around him didn't just warp, it submitted. He didn't have a domain that he needed to project. His actual physical body was the domain. Sovereign Kang's projection flickered, growing incredibly faint as the energy sustaining him was absorbed. "You survived it," Kang whispered, his voice filled with awe. "A body that can house a dimension. Go, anomaly. Show the central continent what true strength looks like." The projection faded into nothingness. Simultaneously, the palace began to violently shake. Without the world seed to anchor the spatial laws, the pocket dimension of the ancient sovereign's ruin was collapsing. Chapter 52, Collapse of the Pocket Dimension. Rudra walked out of the heavy bronze doors just as the purple sky above began to crack like a porcelain mirror. Massive fissures in reality opened up, sucking the rusted metal trees into the dark, endless void beyond. Kalen and the other three elites were huddled on the obsidian staircase, panicking as chunks of the palace began to float upward, gravity completely failing. At the bottom of the stairs, Jian Chen lay bleeding and semi-conscious. "Initiate Vyas!" Kalen yelled over the deafening roar of tearing space. "The gate is destabilizing. We have less than 2 minutes before this entire dimension implodes." Rudra didn't run. He calmly descended the stairs. With his new physical baseline and the passive infinity surrounding him, the chaotic spatial tears didn't affect him. A massive chunk of obsidian fell from the palace roof directly toward his head. Rudra didn't even look up. The moment the boulder came within an inch of his skin, it slowed down infinitely, stopping completely in mid-air. Rudra casually tapped it with his finger, and the kinetic force shattered the boulder into dust. Kalen stared in utter disbelief. He didn't sense any chi, but Rudra was completely untouched by the apocalyptic environment. Rudra walked past Jian Chen's body. He grabbed the heavenly sword sex genius by the collar of his white robes and lifted him like a sack of grain. "Gather around me," Rudra commanded the Sector 7 elites. Kalen and the others rushed to his side. Rudra expanded his infinity barrier just enough to cover the 4 elites. "Do not step outside this radius. Let's go." "Soru!" Rudra shot forward, carrying Jian Chen and maintaining the spatial bubble around his allies. They blurred through the collapsing iron forest. Spatial tears ripped across their path, annihilating everything they touched, but the moment the tears brushed against Rudra's infinity, they harmlessly slid off. Unable to cross the conceptual infinite distance. Ahead, the violet vortex of the exit portal was violently shrinking, fluctuating wildly. "It's closing," one of the elites screamed. Rudra narrowed his eyes. He channeled his new, terrifying level of physical strength into his legs. He didn't just jump, he kicked the space behind him, using spatial friction as a solid foothold. They launched like a golden comet directly into the shrinking violet vortex, breaching the threshold a split second before the entire pocket dimension folded in on itself and vanished from existence. Chapter 53, The Wrath of the Sword Elder. The staging ground crater in the borderlands was tense. The central continent elders stood at the edge of the crater, waiting for their disciples to emerge with the sovereign's treasures. Suddenly, the massive stone archway cracked down the middle. A violet explosion of displaced air blasted outward, throwing several lower-level guards off their feet. From the explosion, Rudra landed perfectly on the solid bedrock, the 4 Sector 7 elites stumbling behind him, gasping for air. The Heavenly Sword Elder instantly stepped forward, his eyes scanning the group. When he didn't see the pristine white robes of his disciples, a dark look crossed his face. Then, Rudra casually tossed a bloody, broken body onto the ground at the elder's feet. The elder looked down. It took him 3 seconds to recognize the shattered, chi-less body as young Master Jian Chen. "Chener." The elder's voice trembled, a terrifying, icy dread pooling in his stomach. He knelt, scanning the boy's body with his spiritual sense. The dantian was gone. The meridians were shredded. Who did this? The elder's voice was a dead, hollow whisper that made the surrounding central continent leaders step back. "I did," Rudra said flatly. "He got in my way." The silence that followed was absolute. Head Examiner Vane, standing nearby, went pale. He had told Rudra to avoid the central heirs, not cripple their most important prodigy. "You." The elder stood up. His eyes rolled back, and the sky above the crater instantly darkened. "A domain realm expert." Unlike Jian Chen's fragile, pseudo-domain, this was a true domain of absolute mastery. A sphere of hypercondensed sword chi, spanning 500 meters, instantly enveloped the entire crater. The gravity multiplied by 200. Thousands of tangible, razor-sharp swords materialized in the air, all pointed directly at Rudra. "I will not just kill you," the elder's voice echoed from every direction simultaneously. "I will extract your soul and burn it in the sex furnace for 1,000 years. I will slaughter your family, your academy, and everyone in your pathetic sector." "Vane, get your students back," Rudra said, his voice perfectly calm despite standing in the epicenter of a true domain. Vane didn't hesitate. He erected his own domain barrier and dragged Kalen and the elites backward, out of the immediate blast zone. The Heavenly Sword Elder pointed a single, trembling finger at Rudra. "Die!" All 10,000 swords descended upon Rudra at once, moving at supersonic speeds, carrying enough destructive force to annihilate a small city. Chapter 54, The Absolute Apex. The swords struck. A massive, blinding explosion of silver light engulfed Rudra. The bedrock of the crater vaporized instantly, creating a secondary crater hundreds of feet deep. The shockwave forced even the other central continent elders to deploy their chi shields just to avoid being blown away. The Heavenly Sword Elder breathed heavily, his eyes burning with vengeance. "Not even dust remains. Are you finished?" The voice came from the center of the dust cloud. The elder froze. The dust slowly cleared, swept away by an invisible, repelling force. Rudra was standing in the exact center of the crater. His uniform didn't even have a wrinkle. The thousands of Xiantian swords were frozen in mid-air, exactly 1 millimeter away from his skin. They vibrated furiously, the elder pushing his domain to the absolute limit, but they could not cross that final millimeter. Infinity. What kind of artifact is that? The elder stammered, his mind unable to comprehend the defense. No domain can withstand my heavenly severing array. How are you blocking this? I'm not blocking it, Rudra said, his eyes glowing a vibrant crimson as the Sharingan spun to life. You just can't reach me. Rudra casually waved his hand. The spatial friction inherent in his movement shattered the thousands of frozen swords into harmless motes of light. My turn. Rudra didn't use the inner gates. He didn't need them anymore. With his vessel upgraded to the domain realm equivalent via the world seed, his base power was catastrophic. He used Soru. He bypassed the physical distance of the crater in absolute zero time. He appeared directly in front of the heavenly sword elder. The elder, reacting with the instincts of a centuries-old master, manifested a concentrated shield of pure sword intent. Rudra coated his fist in armament haki. He punched. His fist hit the domain-level shield. The infinity surrounding his hand inverted, turning the spatial barrier into a weapon of absolute pressure. Crack! The elder's unbreakable shield shattered instantly. Rudra's fist buried itself deep into the elder's chest. The kinetic force didn't just break ribs, it completely displaced the air behind the elder, sending a visible sonic shockwave tearing through the atmosphere. The elder was launched backward like a cannonball. He smashed through the remains of the stone archway, skipped across the wasteland plains, and crashed through a small mountain a mile away, triggering a localized earthquake. The staging ground was utterly silent. The leaders of the Void Dragon Empire and the Nine Suns Pavilion stared at the teenager in black, feeling a cold sweat break out on their backs. A domain realm elder of the central continent had just been swatted away like a fly by a boy with no chi signature. Rudra lowered his fist, rolling his shoulder to ease a slight stiffness. He turned and looked at head examiner Vane, who was staring at him with his jaw practically unhinged. I think we're done here, examiner, Rudra said, walking toward the Academy's dreadnought. Let's go home. Chapter 55, The Silence of the Continent. The dust from the shattered mountain settled, but the silence in the staging ground remained absolute. The leaders of the Void Dragon Empire and the Nine Suns Pavilion, both domain realm experts in their own right, did not move a single muscle. Their eyes were locked onto the distant, smoking crater where the heavenly sword elder had been swatted like a nuisance. And then back to the 16-year-old boy walking calmly toward the Academy's dreadnought. They had lived for hundreds of years. They had seen geniuses who could cross realms to fight. But they had never seen a mortal vessel perfectly negate a true domain and one-shot its creator purely with kinetic force. Do not provoke him, the leader of the Void Dragon Empire transmitted telepathically to his disciples, his hands sweating. That boy, he is not cultivating chi. He is cultivating a physical Dao. If he wanted to, he could slaughter every single one of us before we could even form a hand seal. Examiner Vane stood frozen at the base of the dreadnought's ramp. As Rudra walked past him, Vane felt an instinctual urge to bow. Examiner, Rudra said, pausing on the ramp. Are we leaving, or do you want to stay and chat with them? And no, Vane stammered, recovering his composure. Board the ship. All initiates, board immediately. The massive anti-gravity engines of the Sector 7 dreadnought roared to life, kicking up a storm of dust. The Central Continent factions watched in stunned silence as the outer sector ship ascended into the violent atmospheric storms, carrying a monster back to the borderlands. Inside the ship, the atmosphere was suffocating. Kalen and the elites sat in the corner of the transport bay, too terrified to even look at Rudra. Rudra sat by the viewport, resting his chin on his hand. He could feel his Kryptonian cells rapidly synthesizing the massive amount of energy he had absorbed from the world seed. His body was a self-sustaining ecosystem now. The infinity barrier hummed passively under his skin, an absolute conceptual shield. You crippled their young master and killed an elder, Vane said, walking over and taking a seat across from Rudra. He looked aged, the stress of the day weighing heavily on him. The Heavenly Sword Sect is a Leviathan, Rudra. Their sect master is a soul transformation expert. He has lived for 1,000 years and comprehends the law of the sword. He can cut through dimensions with a thought. Let him come, Rudra replied smoothly, not looking away from the viewport. Vane sighed. Sector 7 cannot withstand a war with the central continent. There won't be a war, Vane, Rudra turned his crimson flashing eyes toward the older man. A war implies two equal sides. If they step into my sector, it will just be an execution. Chapter 56, The Bowing of Kings. When the dreadnought landed back in Sector 7, the political landscape of the city shifted overnight. Word of the events at the Sovereign's Gate spread like wildfire among the highest echelons of the city's ruling families. The head examiner personally escorted Rudra back to the Vyas estate, a gesture that signaled absolute, undeniable academy backing. The Vyas patriarch stood at the gates of his estate, trembling as he watched his grandson approach. He had heard the rumors, but seeing the unfathomable depth in Rudra's eyes confirmed it. The crippled boy was gone. A deity walked in his place. The next morning, the skies over the Vyas estate darkened. Hundreds of heavily armed guards from the Rathore family marched down the street, leading a procession. At the front of the procession was Vikramaditya Rathore, the tyrannical patriarch of the eastern markets. The Vyas guards panicked, drawing their weapons, thinking it was a full-scale assault. But Vikramaditya didn't draw his weapon. He walked to the front gates of the Vyas estate, dropped to both knees, and pressed his forehead against the cold pavement. The Rathore family begs for mercy. Vikramaditya's voice boomed through the sector, carrying no pride, only absolute terror. We surrender all our markets, all our mineral rights, and our core techniques. We ask only that young Master Rudra spares our bloodline. Rudra stepped out onto the balcony of his family's manor, looking down at the kneeling Hushan Grand Master. Daily sign-in reset. Location, Vyas family estate, apex position achieved, ... Would you like to sign in? Sign in. Sign in successful. Reward, Kryptonian Heat Vision, DC Universe Fragment. The ability to focus the hyper-condensed solar/ambient energy stored within the host's cells and project it from the eyes as a concentrated beam of absolute thermal destruction. Temperature scales with host's physical density and energy reserves. Rudra felt a terrifying, burning pressure build behind his retinas. The Kryptonian cells eagerly adapted, creating microscopic energy conduits behind his eyes. He looked down at Vikramaditya. He didn't speak. He simply activated the heat vision for a fraction of a millisecond. Two beams of blinding, ruby-red light shot from Rudra's eyes. They didn't hit Vikramaditya, they struck the solid titanium security gate a few inches from the Rathore patriarch's hands. The titanium didn't melt. It instantly vaporized into superheated gas. A clean, bottomless hole was burned directly into the planet's crust. Vikramaditya scrambled backward, pale as a ghost, staring at the bubbling slag. Leave the deeds at the door, Rudra's voice floated down from the balcony. And if I ever see a Rathore wearing crimson in my city again, I'll burn your estate to the ground. Yes. Yes, young master. Vikramaditya scrambled to his feet, leaving a spatial pouch full of deeds on the ground before fleeing with his men. The Vyas family was now the undisputed ruler of Sector 7. But Rudra knew this was just a momentary peace. The true storm was brewing in the central continent. Chapter 57, The Sky Shatters. 2 weeks passed. Rudra spent the time seamlessly integrating the world seed's spatial density into his Kryptonian cells. His body was now so dense that if he didn't actively suppress his weight with his bioaura, his footsteps would trigger localized earthquakes. On the 15th day, the ambient chi in Sector 7 suddenly stopped flowing. Cultivators across the city fell to their knees, gasping as the energy they relied on to breathe was forcefully stripped from the atmosphere. The sky, usually a smoggy grey, violently split open. A colossal flying fortress, shaped like a massive silver sword, descended through the clouds. It was 10 miles long, completely blotting out the sun. The pressure radiating from the ship was so absolute that the city's kinetic shields shattered like fragile glass. The heavenly sword sect had arrived. At the bow of the ship stood an old man in flowing golden robes. He didn't project a domain. He didn't need to. He had transcended the physical manipulation of energy. He was at the soul transformation realm. He communicated directly with the laws of the universe. This was Patriarch Jian Wushuan. Rudra Vyas, the Patriarch's voice did not echo in the air, it manifested directly inside the minds of every living being in Sector 7, causing millions to bleed from their noses. You crippled the future of my sect. You murdered my elder. Today, this entire sector will be erased from the map. In the elite wing of the academy, head examiner Vane collapsed to one knee, coughing up blood. The sheer conceptual weight of a soul transformation expert's law of the sword was cutting his internal organs just by existing in the same airspace. It's over, Vane whispered in despair. A law comprehension strike, it cuts the very concept of life. Suddenly, a sonic boom shattered the glass of the elite wing. Vane looked up. A streak of black and crimson had launched itself from the Vyas estate, tearing through the sky like a reverse meteor. Rudra didn't use lightness skills. Utilizing Jeppo, Skywalk, reinforced by his domain-level physical strength, he kicked the air so hard that the atmosphere ignited behind him. He ascended directly toward the massive silver fortress. Chapter 58, The Law of the Sword. Rudra halted his ascent, floating 100 meters away from the bow of the colossal ship. His black uniform fluttered in the violent winds. His Sharingan was active, spinning rapidly as it analyzed the terrifying, conceptual energy radiating from the golden-robed Patriarch. So you are the anomaly, Patriarch Jian Wushuan sneered, his eyes filled with divine contempt. A mortal who relies on brute strength. You think your physical density can stop the law of the sword? The Patriarch didn't draw a physical weapon. He slowly raised 2 fingers. The law of the sword dictates that all things can be severed, the Patriarch spoke. It wasn't an incantation, it was a command to the universe. Space, time, karma, and flesh. Sever. He swiped his 2 fingers downward. There was no beam of energy. There was no massive projection. The universe simply obeyed the command. A conceptual line of absolute severance appeared directly over Rudra's body. Down in the city, Vane watched in horror. A conceptual strike cannot be dodged. It rewrites reality so that the target is already cut. The conceptual line struck Rudra. Screech. A sound like agonizing metal tearing echoed across the heavens. The conceptual law of the sword clashed with the absolute, passive defense of infinity. The law dictated that Rudra must be cut. Infinity dictated that the cut must travel an infinite distance to reach him. Space violently warped and buckled around Rudra, forming a chaotic halo of distorted reality. For the first time, Rudra felt a slight pressure against his skin. The law of the sword was slowly, agonizingly grinding its way through the infinite space, fueled by the soul transformation expert's sheer willpower. You block the Deo with your flesh. The Patriarch's eyes widened in absolute shock. Impossible. The heavenly Deo is absolute. Your Deo is weak, Rudra said, his voice cold and echoing with the heavy bass of his Kryptonian vocal cords. It relies on the universe's permission. I don't ask for permission. Rudra raised his head. His eyes glowed with a terrifying, blinding ruby-red light. Let's see if your Deo can cut a star. Chapter 59, The Biokinetic Singularity. Rudra unleashed the Kryptonian heat vision. 2 beams of hypercondensed, unadulterated thermal energy erupted from his eyes. This wasn't standard fire chi. It was the raw, localized temperature of a stellar core, amplified by Rudra's domain-level physical output. The ruby beam struck the descending conceptual line of the sword law. The heat was so absolute that it didn't just burn the air, it ignited the ambient chi. The universe itself caught fire. The conceptual sword strike, unable to withstand the raw, anomalous physics of a Kryptonian starburst, melted into nothingness. The heat vision continued its path, striking the heavy energy shields of the 10-mile-long silver fortress. Boom! The shields, designed to withstand siege attacks from rival central continent empires, instantly vaporized. The ruby beams carved a massive, molten trench through the bow of the ship, incinerating hundreds of elite disciples in a fraction of a second. Patriarch Jian Wushuan barely managed to dodge, utilizing a spatial warp to reappear high above the ship. His golden robes were singed, his face contorted in a mixture of rage and terror. "Demon," the Patriarch roared. "You are a primordial demon." The Patriarch clapped his hands together. Above him, a colossal, glowing golden figure materialized, his nascent soul projecting its true form. The figure held a sword made of pure, concentrated law. Heavenly Deo Judgment, the final severing. The massive golden avatar swung the sword down. The sky tore open, revealing the dark void of space behind the atmosphere. This strike was meant to cleave the entire Sector 7 in half, destroying Rudra and millions of innocents in a single blow. Warning: incoming conceptual law attack detected. Would host like to initiate an emergency sign-in? Sign in! Rudra roared, his scion blood boiling at the prospect of the clash. Sign-in successful. Reward: hollow purple, Jujutsu Kaisen Universe Fragment. The fusion of convergence, blue, and divergence, red. Translated via host's biology, the fusion of absolute kinetic expansion and absolute spatial collapse, creating a mass of imaginary mass that erases everything it touches. Chapter 60, Erasure. Knowledge flooded Rudra's brain. He didn't have cursed energy, but he had spatial friction, infinite density, and complete control over his biokinetic aura. He deactivated his heat vision. The massive golden sword of the Patriarch's nascent soul was descending, tearing the sky apart. Rudra raised his right hand, pointing his index finger up. He channeled his world seed's spatial density. Convergence. A glowing, azure blue sphere of violently pulling gravity formed at his fingertip. He raised his left hand. He channeled his third gate kinetic force. Divergence. A glowing, blood-red sphere of violently expanding kinetic energy formed. "Take your heavenly Deo," Rudra said, his voice echoing perfectly in the silent, suppressed airspace. He brought his hands together. The blue and the red merged. The universe seemed to hold its breath. The color vanished from the sky, replaced by a terrifying, pulsating sphere of violet energy. It didn't radiate heat or pressure. It radiated absence. It was imaginary mass, a concept that the universe's physics could not process, and therefore, it simply erased whatever it touched to correct the error. Biokinetic singularity, purple. Rudra flicked his wrist forward. The violet sphere shot upward, expanding instantly into a massive, conceptual wave of erasure. It met the descending golden sword of the Patriarch's nascent soul. There was no explosion. There was no shockwave. The golden sword simply ceased to exist. The violet wave continued upward, washing over the massive nascent soul avatar, and finally, over Patriarch Jian Wushuan himself. "No, the Deo is absolute, this is." The Patriarch's words were cut off. His golden robes, his flesh, his invincible soul transformation realm core, all of it was erased from reality. The violet wave didn't stop. It washed over the 10-mile-long silver fortress of the Heavenly Sword Sect. The indestructible metal, the thousands of disciples, the massive energy arrays. Cleanly, silently erased. A perfectly circular, 10-mile-wide hole was left in the clouds, revealing the stars in the daytime sky. The Heavenly Sword Sect's invasion fleet, and its soul transformation patriarch, were simply gone. Rudra floated in the sky, his hands lowered, the faint violet glow dissipating from his fingertips. He looked down at Sector 7. Millions of people were on their knees, not out of suppression, but out of absolute, God-fearing worship. The system chimed in his head. System notification: host has successfully erased a soul transformation entity and shattered a conceptual law using anomalous physics. Assimilation progress: Scion bloodline at 40%. Kryptonian cells at 35%. Limitless at 20%. Notice: the heavenly Deo of this planetary realm has officially recognized host as a threat-level anomaly. The dimensional barriers to the higher realms are weakening. Rudra smirked, looking up at the stars through the hole he had just carved in the sky. The earthly realms were conquered. It was time to look toward the ascendant realms. Chapter 61, The Planet's Rejection. The erasure of the Heavenly Sword Sex Invasion Fleet did not just end a war, it shattered the fundamental understanding of cultivation on the planet. For 3 days, Sector 7 was dead silent. There were no celebrations, only a quiet, terrified reverence. The massive, perfectly circular hole in the clouds remained, a permanent scar in the atmosphere where the laws of the universe had been forcibly deleted. In the courtyard of the Vyas estate, Rudra sat cross-legged under the shade of an ancient Bodhi tree. He wasn't meditating to gather chi. He was trying to suppress his own physical presence. His body had become too dense. The fusion of the world seed, Kryptonian cells, and Scion blood had pushed his mass to a terrifying extreme. If he turned off his passive bioelectric aura for even a second, his pure physical weight would cause the tectonic plates beneath the estate to crack. Examiner Vane stood a few dozen feet away, sweating profusely just from the passive gravitational pull Rudra naturally emitted. The central continent has completely sealed its borders, Vane reported, his voice filled with awe. The Void Dragon Empire and the Nine Suns Pavilion have entered a state of absolute isolation. They believe you are a reincarnation of a primordial deity. No one will ever threaten Sector 7 or your family again. Good, Rudra opened his eyes, the dark irises completely calm. Because I can't stay here much longer. Vane frowned. What do you mean? You are the absolute ruler of this world now. Not the world, Rudra corrected, looking up at the sky. Just this dimension. The heavenly Deo of this planet, the localized consciousness of the universe, is rejecting me. As if responding to his words, the sky above Sector 7 violently rumbled. It wasn't the sound of thunder, it was the sound of reality groaning under immense pressure. Thick, blood-red clouds began to rapidly gather, swirling into a colossal vortex directly above the Vyas estate. A heavenly tribulation. Vane gasped, falling to his knees as the oppressive weight of the universe pressed down. But tribulations are only for those attempting to ascend to the divine sea realm. You are a mortal vessel. The universe doesn't care about titles, Vane. Rudra stood up. It recognizes a glitch in its system. It recognizes something that isn't bound by its rules. And it wants to delete it. Rudra rolled his shoulders, the sound like grinding tectonic plates. Tell my grandfather I leave the family in his hands. I have an appointment upstairs. Chapter 62, The Eye of Heaven. Rudra bent his knees. He didn't use an aura or a technique. He simply leaped. Boom! The shockwave leveled the Bodhi tree and shattered the reinforced glass of the Vyas manor. Rudra shot upward like a fired artillery shell, breaking the sound barrier a dozen times over in a fraction of a second. He breached the planet's stratosphere, stopping dead in the upper atmosphere, floating in the freezing void directly beneath the blood-red vortex of the heavenly tribulation. At the center of the vortex, a massive, glowing golden eye opened. It was emotionless, cold, and absolute. It was the manifestation of the planet's heavenly Deo. Warning: planetary heavenly Deo has initiated eradication protocol. Incoming attack, conceptual lightning of destruction. This attack bypasses physical durability to strike the fundamental concept of the target's existence. You want to erase me? Rudra muttered, his scion blood flaring with absolute defiance. I already showed your pets what real erasure looks like. Daily sign-in reset. Location, edge of planetary atmosphere, tribulation zone, ... Would you like to sign in? Sign in. Sign in successful. Reward, Hawkeye, Destruction, Energy Fragment, Dragon Ball Super Universe. The absolute energy of a god of destruction. It does not destroy, it erases matter, energy, souls, and concepts from existence entirely. Adapted to host, fueled by host's biokinetic reserves rather than divine ki. A dark, terrifying purple aura erupted around Rudra. It wasn't the imaginary mass of hollow purple, it was something far more primal. It was the absolute end of all things. The space around him didn't just warp, it began to dissolve into nothingness. The eye of heaven narrowed. A colossal pillar of blood-red lightning, infused with the ultimate law of destruction, fired downward, aimed directly at Rudra. Rudra didn't dodge. He raised his right hand, pointing his palm at the descending wrath of the universe. The purple energy condensed around his hand into a sphere of absolute, destructive sovereignty. Hawkeye. Rudra released the energy. The dark purple blast met the blood-red conceptual lightning. There was no struggle. There was no explosion. The moment the Hawkeye touched the heavenly Tao's lightning, the tribulation simply dissolved. The purple energy continued upward, entirely erasing the lightning bolt, and slammed directly into the massive golden eye of heaven. The sky let out a sound like a dying god. The eye of heaven violently shattered, its conceptual laws turning to dust. The blood-red clouds instantly vanished, revealing the cold, endless expanse of the cosmos. Rudra floated in the silent void, his hand lowered. He had just erased the consciousness of the planet. System notification, planetary heavenly Dao destroyed. Dimensional lock broken. The pathway to the ascendant realms, the divine sea, is now open. Above him, the fabric of space tore open, revealing a blindingly bright, golden dimensional tunnel. It radiated an energy so dense that a single breath of it would cause a mortal cultivator on Earth to spontaneously combust. Rudra didn't hesitate. He engaged his flight, shooting straight into the golden tunnel, leaving the mortal world behind forever. Chapter 63, The Ascendant Realm. The transition through the dimensional tunnel was unlike anything Rudra had experienced. The spatial friction was millions of times heavier than the Sovereign's pocket dimension. The tunnel tried to strip his flesh from his bones, filtering out any existence that had not formed a nascent soul. But Rudra had no nascent soul. His body was his soul. His Kryptonian cells, supercharged by the Hawkeye energy and the World Seed, formed an absolute, impenetrable bio-aura. He tore through the dimensional barrier through pure, unadulterated physical violence. He emerged on the other side and plummeted. Gravity here was not 100x Earth's. It was 10,000x. Rudra crashed into the ground, the impact creating a crater the size of a small city, kicking up plumes of glowing, crystal-like dust. He slowly stood up from the center of the crater, wiping a drop of golden blood from his lip. The Wolverine healing factor sealed the micro-tears in his muscles instantly. He looked around. The sky was an infinite, swirling ocean of golden chi. Massive, floating islands hovered in the sky, connected by bridges of solid starlight. The trees here were miles high, their leaves pulsing with the fundamental laws of the universe. This was the Ascendant Realm. A place where law comprehension experts were mere foot soldiers, and divine sea, martial saints, ruled the territories. Rudra took a breath. The air wasn't gas, it was practically liquid spiritual energy. As it entered his lungs, his Kryptonian cells devoured it with terrifying speed, rapidly evolving his physical baseline to match the new environmental pressure. Suddenly, his observation haki pinged. 3 figures descended from the golden sky, landing at the edge of the crater. They wore intricate, starry robes that seemed to contain actual galaxies. Their auras were suffocating, bending the light around them. Law Comprehension Realm. Martial Emperors. A dimensional breach, the lead figure, a tall man with silver hair and eyes that crackled with spatial lightning, said coldly. Someone forced their way up from the lower realms without passing the heavenly gate. Look at him, Commander, the second figure, a woman radiating a blistering law of fire, sneered. He has no nascent soul. He has no internal chi. His vessel is purely mortal. How did a piece of lower realm trash survive the dimensional pressure? It doesn't matter, the commander said, drawing a blade made of pure, condensed space. The punishment for illegal ascension is soul extraction. Exterminate the anomaly. Chapter 64, A different kind of soul. Rudra rolled his neck, the cracking joints echoing like thunderclaps in the heavy gravity. You people really all sound the same, no matter what dimension I'm in, Rudra sighed. Daily sign-in reset. Location, the Ascendant Realm, Golden Shore. Would you like to sign in? Sign in. Sign in successful. Reward, Spiritual Pressure, Ryatsu, Bleach Universe, Kenpei Kizera Key Fragment. The physical manifestation of the soul's raw power. As the host's body and soul are unified into a singular absolute vessel, this Ryatsu manifests as an overwhelmingly dense, physical weight that suppresses magic, chi, and laws through pure savage intimidation. The woman radiating the law of fire stepped forward. Burned to nothingness, mortal. She snapped her fingers. The law of fire didn't travel, it simply existed around Rudra. The space within the crater instantly ignited into a conceptual inferno designed to burn the soul directly, bypassing physical defenses entirely. Rudra stood in the center of the conceptual fire. He didn't use the infinity barrier. He didn't use Hawkeye. He just unleashed his Ryatsu. A colossal, untamed pillar of golden yellow spiritual pressure erupted from Rudra's unified vessel. It shot into the sky, piercing the golden clouds. It wasn't refined or elegant. It was savage, brutal, and overwhelmingly heavy. The conceptual law of fire surrounding Rudra was instantly snuffed out, violently suppressed by the sheer, unadulterated mass of Rudra's spiritual presence. The 3 martial emperors froze. The immense weight of the Ryatsu slammed into them, forcing them to channel all of their law energy just to remain standing. What is this? The woman screamed, her law of fire flickering and dying under the pressure. This isn't a nascent soul. It feels like a primordial beast. His body and his soul. The commander gasped, his eyes wide with horror as he struggled against the gravity-like pressure of the Ryatsu. They aren't separate. He cultivated his mortal flesh until his soul merged with it. He's a unified anomaly. Rudra stepped out of the crater. The ground beneath his feet turned to fine powder with every step. You wanted to extract my soul. Rudra grinned, his Sharingan spinning wildly. Come and take it. Chapter 65, Shattering the Emperors. The third emperor, a massive man wielding the law of earth, roared in defiance. He slammed his hands into the ground. Earth law, continental crush. The ground on either side of Rudra violently surged upward, turning into 2 massive, continent-sized hands of solid bedrock, infused with unbreakable conceptual weight. Aiming to clap Rudra into paste. Rudra didn't stop walking. He didn't even look at the massive hands. He casually raised his right arm and swung it backward, coating it in pitch-black armament haki layered with his terrifyingly dense Ryatsu. Boom! The backhand strike didn't just shatter the earth hand. The kinetic shockwave propagated through the law of earth itself, traveling through the ground and exploding directly beneath the massive emperor's feet. The emperor was launched into the air, his lower half completely pulverized by the kinetic backlash. He didn't even have time to scream before Rudra vanished using Soru. Rudra reappeared above the airborne emperor and delivered a devastating axe kick to the man's chest. The emperor was driven into the ground with the force of a meteor, his body and his nascent soul completely annihilated by the sheer physical density of the strike. One martial emperor dead in less than 2 seconds. The commander and the fire empress stared in absolute, mind-shattering terror. In the ascendant realm, fights between emperors usually lasted for days, involving complex manipulations of universal laws. This boy had just brutally beaten an emperor to death with his bare hands. "Monster," the commander whispered. He raised his spatial blade, his hands trembling. "Spatial law, dimensional exile." He swung the blade, tearing a massive, black rift in space directly behind Rudra, attempting to suck him into the chaotic void between universes. Rudra turned his head. The massive suction force of the void pulled at his clothes, but his body didn't budge a single millimeter. His world seed assimilation provided absolute spatial anchoring. He was heavier than the void itself. "You call that a spatial tier?" Rudra raised his hand, pointing 2 fingers at the commander. "Hollow purple." The violet sphere of imaginary mass instantly formed and fired. It moved so fast that the commander's spatial senses couldn't even register it. The violet energy bypassed the spatial blade entirely and struck the commander in the chest. Cleanly, silently, the commander's upper torso was erased from reality. His legs stood for a brief second before collapsing to the ground. Chapter 66, The New Apex. The Fire Empress was the only one left. She fell to her knees, the absolute terror of the situation breaking her mind. She was a law comprehension expert, a being who could wipe out entire lower realms with a thought. Yet, she was completely helpless against this physical monstrosity. Rudra walked up to her, his heavy footsteps echoing like a death knell. He looked down at her, his Ryotsu pressing her face into the crystalline dirt. "This realm," Rudra said, his voice cold and devoid of mercy. "Who rules it?" "The Divine Sea Sovereigns," the Empress sobbed, blood leaking from her eyes due to the spiritual pressure. "They rule the 9 territories of the Ascendant Realm. We are just border patrol for the Azure Cloud territory." "Divine Sea," Rudra repeated, remembering the ancient texts. "Martial saints. Beings whose internal energy had formed a vast ocean, capable of surviving in the vacuum of the cosmos and destroying planets." "Take me to them," Rudra ordered. "They will kill you," she screamed hysterically. "A martial saint has near infinite energy. You are just a brute. You cannot fight an ocean." Rudra knelt down, his crimson Sharingan locking onto her terrified eyes. "I don't need to fight the ocean," Rudra whispered, his scion bloodline pulsing with the thrill of the upcoming cosmic war. "I'm going to boil it." He grabbed the Empress by the collar of her robes, lifting her effortlessly in the 10,000x gravity. "Point the way." As Rudra looked out over the endless, golden expanse of the Ascendant Realm, the system chimed one more time. "System notification, host has firmly established a presence in a higher dimension. The cosmic progression phase has initiated. Next target, Divine Sea, Martial Saint, Entity. Host's physical vessel is currently unbound. Prepare for infinite scaling." The earthly realms were a memory. The Ascendant Realms were about to learn the true meaning of fear. Rudra launched himself into the golden sky, dragging his guide behind him, ready to tear down the heavens themselves. Chapter 67, The Azure Cloud Citadel. The journey to the Azure Cloud Citadel was not a travel, it was a demonstration of absolute, terrifying power. Rudra did not ride a flying beast or a vessel. He dragged the Fire Empress by the collar, moving through the sky by kicking the very atmosphere with the force of an artillery shell. Every time Rudra's feet impacted the air, sonic booms rippled across the horizon, shattering the crystalline clouds and leaving massive, glowing trails of disturbed spiritual energy. "Stop, please," the Empress gasped, her body barely holding together under the 10,000x gravity and the supersonic speeds. If we approach the citadel like this, the Divine Sea Sovereigns will see us as an invasion force. Good, Rudra replied. The Azure Cloud Citadel was a city-state floating on a massive, continent-sized shard of stardust. It was protected by a dome of pure law energy that shimmered like a diamond. Within the dome, hundreds of martial emperors practiced their techniques, their auras creating a miniature sun at the center of the city. As Rudra approached, the citadel's defensive array activated. Thousands of golden ballistae materialized, locking onto his position. Intruder detected, a voice boomed from the citadel's ramparts, the projection of a divine sea sovereign, a man with skin like polished bronze and hair made of flowing water. Identify yourself and kneel, or be obliterated. Rudra didn't stop. He didn't slow down. He didn't even draw a weapon. He simply focused on his physical density, layering the armament haki and the residual world seed energy over his forward-facing silhouette. Identify this, Rudra whispered. He plummeted toward the golden dome at Mach 50. Chapter 68, Shattering the Sacred Dome. The defensive array fired. Thousands of beams of condensed law energy, each capable of vaporizing a mountain, hammered into Rudra's infinity barrier. The flashes of light were blinding, turning the sky into a strobe light of destruction. Rudra didn't even flinch. The infinity barrier, reinforced by his spatial anchoring, reduced the incoming attacks to harmless sparks. He continued his descent, the friction of his passage turning his body into a glowing, white-hot meteor. The dome is not enough, the Divine Sea Sovereign on the ramparts roared, his eyes widening in panic. Merge the laws. Form the absolute barrier. The entire citadel shifted. The martial emperors within the dome synchronized their energy, turning the dome into a translucent, hardened sphere of conceptual reality. It was a barrier designed to withstand the crushing pressure of the cosmos. Rudra slammed into the sphere. Silence. For a split second, the sound of the entire world vanished. Then, a spider web of black cracks, not energy, but absolute spatial ruptures exploded across the surface of the sacred dome. Rudra didn't strike with his fist. He struck with his entire mass, his body functioning as a living anchor for the world seed's spatial density. Crash! The dome shattered like a dropped porcelain plate. Rudra plowed through the fragments, the kinetic energy of his descent leveling the outer districts of the citadel instantly. He landed in the central plaza, his feet cracking the solid gold pavement, creating a crater 500 feet deep. He stood up, shaking off the glowing dust. He looked up at the ramparts, where the bronze-skinned Divine Sea Sovereign stood in frozen terror. "I'm here for your ocean," Rudra said. Chapter 69, The Ocean's Pride. The Divine Sea Sovereign, Lord Haku, was a being who had cultivated for 3,000 years. He had seen empires rise and fall. He had conquered planetary systems. He looked down at the teenager in the crater. "You?" Haku's voice trembled, but not with fear, with a primal, predatory rage. "You are not a cultivator. You are a biological anomaly. You possess no energy to drain, no meridians to seal, no soul to tether. You are a parasite of the universe." Haku raised his hands. The air around him turned into a vast, swirling ocean of blue, crystalline chi. This was his divine sea. It wasn't an internal reservoir, it was an externalized manifestation of his entire existence. He controlled the gravity, the temperature, and the laws of probability within this ocean. "Welcome to the bottom of the sea, boy," Haku whispered. The blue ocean descended, swallowing the crater. The pressure became absolute. It wasn't just 10,000x gravity, it was the pressure of an entire planet's mass concentrated into a single point. Rudra fell to his knees. The infinity barrier hissed, the conceptual space being compressed by the sheer volume of Haku's energy. "The ocean is heavy," Rudra thought, his blood pumping a rhythmic, thunderous beat. But it's still just water. He pushed himself up. His bones groaned, his scion bloodline screaming in agony, but his Kryptonian cells were absorbing the blue chi, using it to further fuel his own bioelectric aura. He stood up, his legs shaking, his muscles bulging until they tore and instantly knit themselves back together. "I'm done swimming," Rudra said. He activated the third gate. Then, he pushed past it. Gate of View. Gate of Wonder. Open. The fourth and fifth gates blew open. A massive, roaring torrent of green blood energy exploded from Rudra's pores, evaporating the blue ocean of chi around him. Chapter 70, Evaporation. Rudra moved. He didn't walk, he blurred into a green-red streak of pure, lethal kinetic energy. Haku frantically tried to manipulate the laws of the ocean, turning the chi into blades, gravity wells, and temporal stasis fields. Rudra ignored it all. His body was so dense, and his spatial anchoring so absolute, that the Divine Sea's attempts to manipulate his reality failed. Punch! Rudra's fist smashed through Haku's blue energy armor. Kick! Rudra's leg shattered Haku's ribcage, the kinetic shockwave traveling through the sovereign's body and exploding out his back. Grab! Rudra snatched the sovereign by the head, dragging him through the plaza and slamming him face first into the floating island's bedrock. Haku, the lord of the azure cloud, a martial saint who should have been immortal, was being beaten to death by a boy who didn't even know how to circulate chi. Yield! Haku shrieked, his divine sea flickering and dying. I yield. I will give you the territory. I will give you the resources. Just stop. Rudra stopped. He held the battered, bronze-skinned sovereign by the throat, dangling him over the edge of the floating island, looking down into the endless golden void below. I don't want your territory, Rudra said, his eyes glowing with a terrifying, cold light. I want to know where the next level is. Who is the strongest entity in this realm? Haku looked at the teenager, and for the first time in 3 millennia, he felt the icy grip of true, absolute mortality. The Golden King of the Heavenly Apex, Haku whispered, his voice broken. He is not a martial saint. He is an ancestor, a being who has merged with the Dao itself. He resides at the center of the universe, at the core of all existence. Rudra released Haku, dropping the sovereign onto the broken pavement. The core, Rudra looked up, toward the absolute center of the ascendant realm, where the golden sky seemed to converge into a single, blinding point of infinite light. That's a long walk, Rudra smiled, a savage, hungry expression. But I have time. Chapter 71, The Bridge of Stars. The journey to the core of all existence was not a straight line, it was a climb through the very architecture of the universe. Rudra left the azure cloud citadel behind, ignoring the frantic calls of the martial saints. His trajectory was set for the center of the ascendant realm, where the golden sky began to fold into a singular, blinding point of infinite light. As he traveled, the physical reality of the ascendant realm began to break down. The floating islands were replaced by vast, rotating rings of pure stellar matter. The laws of nature here weren't just present, they were tangible. He passed through rings of time, where the golden light slowed to a crawl, and rings of entropy, where the air itself withered and died. Rudra felt no resistance. His infinity barrier pushed the chaotic laws away, treating them like a slight breeze. Daily sign-in reset. Location, the galactic rings, pre-core zone. Would you like to sign in? Sign in. Sign in successful. Reward, matter manipulation, molecule man fragment, Marvel Universe. The ability to reorganize the atomic structure of inorganic matter. Note, due to host's physical vessel, this is manifested through spatial contact. Anything the host touches can be reconfigured at will. Rudra looked at the rusted metal debris floating in the void, relics of ancient wars. He reached out and touched a jagged piece of dark matter. With a thought, the molecules shivered and rearranged. The dark matter melted and reformed into a sleek, indestructible gauntlet that perfectly fit his hand, humming with the same spatial friction he possessed. Tools, Rudra muttered, closing his fist. The gauntlet became part of his skin. He was no longer just a body. He was becoming the environment itself. Chapter 72, The Gatekeeper. Before he could reach the core, a massive shadow eclipsed the stars. It was a creature of pure logic. It had no face, only a floating, multidimensional geometric shape that constantly shifted. It was a law guardian, a construct of the ancestor realm designed to prevent mortals from reaching the core of all existence. Anomaly, the guardian's voice sounded like 1,000 bells ringing at once. You have crossed the threshold of the forbidden zones. You are a variable that cannot be calculated. You are erased. The guardian didn't fight. It simply thought, and the reality around Rudra vanished. Rudra found himself in a white void. There was no up, no down, no heat, no cold. I have deleted your coordinate, the guardian said, his voice vibrating through the void. You exist nowhere. Rudra stood in the white void. He felt his physical body fading, his psion cells struggling to find a focal point to sustain their mass. The erasure was conceptual. You think coordinates define me? Rudra asked, his voice steady. He activated his conqueror's haki. He didn't target the space. He targeted the will of the guardian. He unleashed a wave of spiritual pressure so dense, so utterly devoid of doubt, that it acted as an anchor for his existence. I am Rudra Vyas, he roared, his Ryatsu shattering the white void. I don't need your coordinates to exist. With a burst of speed powered by the fourth gate, Rudra closed the distance. He didn't punch the guardian, he reached into the geometric shifting of its body and used his new matter manipulation to force the guardian's structure into a state of absolute stillness. The guardian frozen, its shifting shapes locked. Rudra grabbed the core of the guardian and crushed it with his bare hand. The white void shattered like glass. Chapter 73, The Ancestors' Welcome. Rudra emerged into a massive, tranquil garden that hung in the center of the universe. The grass here was made of thin strands of pure, solidified law. The trees were manifestations of time, growing and decaying in a cycle that lasted only seconds. Sitting on a simple wooden bench in the center of the garden was an old man in white robes, drinking tea. The man didn't look like a god. He looked like a grandfather. But Rudra's Sharingan saw the truth. Every breath the man took consumed and recreated 1,000 star systems. This was an ancestor. The Golden King. You have a very loud presence, boy, the Golden King said, not looking up. You've destroyed a soul transformation expert, erased a piece of the heavenly Deo, and broken my gatekeeper. You are very, very noisy. You built a loud cage, Rudra replied, walking toward the bench. It wasn't a cage, the king said, finally looking up. His eyes were galaxies. It was a filter. The universe has a limited amount of energy. If everyone reached the apex, the universe would collapse. I maintain the balance. The universe isn't a museum, Rudra said, stopping before him. It's a furnace. And you're just someone who got tired of burning. The Golden King smiled a genuine, amused smile. You intend to challenge me? I am the ancestor. I am the source of the Deo. To fight me is to fight the concept of existence itself. Then I guess I'll have to rewrite the concept, Rudra replied. Chapter 74, The Duel of Concepts. The Golden King stood up. The garden vanished. They were standing in the heart of the multiverse. Millions of realities were visible around them, pulsing like heartbeats. The king raised a finger. Let there be. He began. But he didn't finish. Rudra moved. He didn't use speed. He used Hawkeye. Rudra didn't target the king, he targeted the air in front of the king. He erased the space between them, closing the distance instantly. The king's eyes widened. He shifted his form, becoming light, then shadow, then pure energy. But Rudra's spatial friction and armament haki caught him every time. It was a battle of two extremes. The king commanded the universe to be, and Rudra commanded it to be silent. The king manifested a sword of pure order. Rudra manifested a fist of pure infinity. The clash sent ripples throughout the multiverse. In a million realities, stars went out. In another million, new ones were born. You are nothing but a body, the king shouted, his form flickering. You have no enlightenment. You have no Deo. My body is my Deo. Rudra roared, shattering the king's blade with a single, brutal headbutt. The king fell back, his form wavering. He had never been struck by physical force in his existence. He didn't know how to handle the pain. Chapter 75, The Absolute Apex. The Golden King lay on the floor of the void, his celestial form dimming. He looked at his hands, confused by the damage. Why, the king whispered. Why do you reject the peace of the Deo? Rudra stood over him, his body glowing with the combined, terrifying power of Scion blood, Kryptonian bioelectricity and the shattered spatial laws of the ruin. He looked like a god of war, a being that the system hadn't even begun to fully categorize. Because, Rudra said, his voice echoing across the multiverse. I don't want to maintain the universe. I want to see what happens when it's free. Rudra reached down and grabbed the king's shoulder. He didn't erase him. He didn't kill him. He poured his Ryatsuo and his spatial anchoring into the king. The Golden King gasped. For the first time in an eon, he wasn't the master of the universe. He was just a man. He felt the cold, the heat, and the weight of his own existence. The filter is gone, Rudra said, pulling his hand away. The universe is going to grow now. Whether it survives or burns, that's not for you to decide. Rudra turned his back on the ancestor and stepped into the blinding light of the core of all existence. System notification, host has surpassed the ancestor realm. The limit of the multiverse has been reached. Initiating singularity ascension. Rudra stepped into the core. His form began to shift, his identity shedding away like a snake's skin. He wasn't just Rudra Vyas anymore. He was the author of his own reality. The story didn't end. It just began. Chapter 76, The Canvas of Non-Existence. Rudra stood in the absolute center of the core. There was no light, no dark, no energy, and no space. It was the great outer void, the white canvas upon which the infinite universes were merely ink blots. His physical form, once a dense, powerful vessel of Scion and Kryptonian potential, had dissolved. He was now a consciousness that existed everywhere and nowhere simultaneously. He could look left and see the birth of a galaxy, he could look right and see the heat death of a civilization he had never known. System notification, host has transcended the multiversal boundary. Status, omnipresence achieved. Omniscience, fragmentary, achieved. Rudra, or what remained of the entity that was once Rudra, looked down at his hands. They were made of the same fabric as the void. So, this is the apex, he thought. The feeling of not needing to cultivate. He reached out and plucked a thread of reality from the air. He wove it, stretching it until it glowed with the heat of a billion suns. He wasn't using energy, he was using his will as a chisel. He had become the sculptor of existence. Chapter 77, The Shadow of the Author. As he began to solidify his new reality, a ripple appeared in the void. It wasn't a universe, and it wasn't a Deo. It was a narrative fracture. From the tier stepped a figure. It looked like Rudra, but it was hollow, a sketch of a man, colorless and static. It moved with the unnatural precision of a puppet on strings. You were never meant to reach this far, the hollow figure said. Its voice sounded like the flipping of pages. You were meant to be a hero of a story about cultivation. You were meant to be the genius who overcame adversity. You were not meant to step outside the book. Rudra felt the weight of the entity. It wasn't a god, it was a constraint. You're the limit, Rudra said, his voice resonating with the weight of 1,000 universes. You're the reason the Golden King couldn't see past the Deo. I am the structure, the entity replied. And you are the error. I am here to prune you. Chapter 78, The Ink-Stained Duel. The entity didn't attack with energy. It attacked with plot. It rewrote the immediate surroundings, turning the void into a forest, then a prison, then a vacuum. It tried to force Rudra back into the hero archetype, stripping away his powers and forcing him into a narrative of struggle and weakness. Rudra's infinity barrier flickered, the narrative pressure trying to force the concept of failure upon him. I am not a character in your script, Rudra thought, his soul blazing with the sheer, stubborn density of his original, broken Dantian self. He didn't use the system. He didn't use Haki. He reached into his own core, the part of him that was still a 16-year-old boy sitting in a dark room, refusing to give up even when he was crippled. He manifested that defiance as a weapon. If this is a story, Rudra said, his hand glowing with the power of his own existence, then I am the one holding the pen. He reached out and grabbed the hollow entity by the throat. He didn't erase it, he rewrote it. He filled the hollow sketch with his own memories, his own pain, and his own, infinite, unyielding will. Chapter 79, The New Multiverse. The hollow entity shrieked, then went silent. Its colors rushed back into its skin. It collapsed, and when it stood up, it was Rudra. Two Rudras stood in the void. The narrative is broken, the second Rudra said. Good, the first Rudra replied. They dissolved into the void together, becoming the background radiation of existence. They were no longer the main characters. They were the environment. They were the rules of physics. They were the potential for every story that hadn't been told yet. The multiverse began to expand, no longer limited by the Golden King's filter. In 1,000 lower realms, heroes suddenly found their limitations gone. Villains realized their reach was infinite. The ascension was no longer a path, it was a choice. Chapter 80, Epilogue, The Apex Singularity. On a small, forgotten planet, deep in the arm of a galaxy that hadn't existed a second ago, a young boy sat in a dark room. He was holding a wooden sword. He was sweating, his muscles aching, his path forward blocked by a world that told him he was nothing. The boy looked at his reflection in the dark window. For a split second, the reflection didn't move. It smiled back at him, a cold, sharp, predatory smile that belonged to someone who had already conquered every god in existence. The boy blinked, and the reflection returned to normal. But the boy stood up. He felt a strange, infinite density in his blood. He felt the silence of the void in his heart. He swung the wooden sword. Crack! The air in the room shattered. The story had ended, but the cultivation had just begun. System offline, host has achieved absolute singularity. The author's pen has been passed. End of story.